Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.
And by the Dominic Ferrioli Foundation. Welcome to this special edition of New York Now on PBS, where we'll hear from both major party candidates for the 19th Congressional District. I'm Dan Clark, the host of New York Now on PBS and the moderator of tonight's debate. The debate has been produced by WMHT in partnership with the Albany Times-Union and WAMC. We welcome our viewers on PBS and those listening on WAMC. Before we get to the candidates, let's introduce tonight's panelists. At the table this year, we have Ed McKinley, a reporter from the Times-Union, and Allison Dunn, the Hudson Valley Bureau Chief for WAMC News. Now let's introduce tonight's candidates. First, we have Congressman Antonio Delgado, a Democrat who's represented the 19th Congressional District since 2019. He lives in Rhinebeck. And to his right, we have Kyle Vandewater, the Republican nominee for the seat. Mr. Vandewater is an attorney from Millbrook who served in Afghanistan. We'll start now with opening statements.
I am running for Congress on the Republican ticket. I'm from New York 19. I happen to actually have been born in Rhinebeck, where Mr. Delgado lives, but I grew up in Poughkeepsie, and I currently live in Millbrook, New York. That's where I came after I did 8 years on active duty. I'm running for Congress because the far left has failed the United States of America, and I believe that my opponent is part of the far left. I run for this race because I know what it's like when I came back from 8 years on active duty to come back to a state that's a one-party system state. And that one party has done nothing but fail this state. That one party has done things like institute no bail reform, which is bad for the state. So I saw the direction that the country was going into. I saw the fact that Nancy Pelosi, who my opponent has voted with 99% of the time, has turned this country over to the far left.
Congressman Delgado, you have 90 seconds.
Thank you. Kyle, it's good to see you. It's good to be here. I want to start by acknowledging there's a lot of pain, a lot of anxiety, a lot of hurt across the country and all throughout New York 19. I know because I'm going all throughout the district, talking to small business owners, talking to farmers, healthcare workers, firefighters, teachers, and I can hear the pain in people's voices, the uncertainty around the corner. But I'm also here to tell you that we can get through it. We can get through it if we come together, if we work together, if we put people before politics, if we think about the community, love our neighbors, show compassion, and do the work. And that's what I've been doing since day one. 47 town halls since being sworn in, 3 in all 11 counties in 2019, 4 locally based bipartisan advisory groups, 5 in-district offices. And this engagement on the ground has led to legislative success.
I want to represent Libertarians and Greens, Democrats and Republicans, voters who all have approximately the same goals but different ideas about how to achieve them. My goal, which unites us all, is to try to decentralize the power that has been concentrated in the hands of the few. When power becomes concentrated in government, politicians can act as though they are above the law and cease to answer to voters. When power becomes concentrated in a few large corporations, business leaders can behave as if they are above the law and cease to be responsive to their own customers. When these two power centers merge, we no longer have a democracy or freedom, and that's where we find ourselves today. We're living in a time when the decisions of technocrats, billionaires, and the political elite affect our daily lives.
Congressman Delgado, before the pandemic, as you just mentioned in your opening statement, you held numerous town halls throughout the district. How have you been engaging with your constituents since the pandemic, and how will you continue to engage if elected?
One of the things that I learned early on when I decided to run is that a lot of people on the ground felt unheard. And this wasn't a partisan issue. This was Democrats, Republicans, Independents. They felt like they didn't have any real connection to the folks that are in Washington doing the work supposedly on their behalf. And so it was important for me to get on the ground and do the work and visit every single town that I could in every single corner of this district. And we did. 3 town halls in all 11 counties, 33 in 2019. And I took all of that information that I got on the ground, and I got busy working on legislation to get us through COVID-19. My Small Business Repayment Relief Act would support 27,000 of our small businesses and self-employed all throughout this district who rely upon SBA loans. The $9 billion that I secure for our farmers is now inside the CARES Act for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. I fought to make sure that our farmers are eligible for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Relief as well.
How would I engage my constituents? Well, I've met with the people of the district about 20 times in the past couple of months, so I'll keep doing what I'm doing. If elected, too, I will give my constituents the opportunity to vote on each bill to tell me how they want me to vote. If there's a supermajority participating and a supermajority is against my preference, I'll reconsider and either change my vote or abstain. This will mean that no lobbyist will be able to buy my vote because the people will have veto power. This is one way to get money out of politics. But in order for this to be possible, first I will have to work to pass H.R. 2240, the One Subject at a Time Act, which limits the length and scope of bills. So no more 1,000-page bills packed with terrible legislation along with a little bit of good legislation. For instance, should there be a $1,200 COVID check for the people? That's one bill. Should there be a big bailout for large corporations or banks? That would be other bills. The One Subject at a Time Act will make it possible for all voters, as well as representatives, to read and understand the bills that before they go up for a vote. Ultimately, though, I would like to see far fewer laws being decided at the federal level. And I want to work toward moving the power of decision-making to the people affected by those decisions.
Mr. Vandewater, how would you engage constituents as a new representative and during the COVID era?
I plan on spending my time here in New York 19 and not down in Washington, D.C. I plan on spending my time talking to farmers, talking to small business owners that are hurting, and meeting people one-on-one. And that's what I've done ever since the lockdown in my district was lowered. I go from county to county. There's 11 in this district. It's one of the biggest districts in the Northeast. In fact, it's bigger than the state of Rhode Island. So my plan is to talk directly to the people and not spend time in Washington, D.C. And I promise you, you are my constituent, not somebody from San Francisco, not someone from Los Angeles, not someone from Chicago, and not someone from Washington, D.C. I will listen to the people, and I will not be taking money from San Francisco, Washington, D.C., or Chicago. I will be talking to the people, and I am the everyman. I am the people's man. I come from a blue-collar family. I may have a white collar because I'm an attorney, but I've worked in Iraq where my father worked, and my mother was a parochial school teacher. And I've served this country. And the reason why I'm doing this is I want to serve the people of New York 19. I've served this country overseas in Afghanistan. I've served it throughout this nation. I've served it in other nations. And I'm here to serve for you.
Mr. Vandewater, New Yorkers have grown accustomed to wearing masks during the pandemic. On the national level, President Trump has rejected a nationwide mask mandate, while former Vice President Joe Biden has supported the idea. Do you support a nationwide mask mandate, or should the decision be left to the states?
And you have 90 seconds.
The localities need to decide what's best for their communities. Big government shouldn't be sitting there telling everybody across the board what you need to do. I'll give you an example. In Delaware County, thank God, there were only 107 reported cases as of 2 weeks ago for COVID. That's a great statistic. People in Delaware County should not be forced to be walking around with face masks. And what I believe is that local communities, whether it's at the state level or at a county level or even at a local level, should be determining whether or not their schools open, whether or not people need to be forced to be walking outside wearing a face mask.
We've had 13,000 cases in New York 19, about close to 500 deaths. If you look across the country, the majority of states have an increase in cases. We're 4% of the world's population, yet make up 22% of all the deaths. We've got to have a nationwide testing plan that is aggressive. And so, yes, I think it's important for us to have a uniform approach.
Pennsylvania and Michigan courts have ruled that mandates are unconstitutional. I believe that healthcare decisions should be made by medical professionals together with their patients. Every human being is different and has different health conditions that might require or exempt them from a mandate. The question of whether or not there should be a federal mask mandate or it should be left to the states to decide. Let me note that the federal government has no such power. In 1905, for the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case, the Supreme Court did rule that state governments have the power to mandate health measures and fine people if they don't comply. But that Supreme Court in 1905 was the same one that gave us Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that racial segregation was constitutional. It was not. And Rosa Parks helped overturn that decision. The danger with mandating health measures is that this will allow a small group of people to decide for everyone and possibly take advantage of the situation for their own political or financial gain. This, of course, goes against everything we believe in as a country. A government can help people protect themselves from the virus, can help organize home delivery for the economically disadvantaged at-risk people. Disability payments could be made available to at-risk workers to allow them to stay home. Government can help people, but not force people. Government can provide good information to help the public make good decisions. We know that over 200,000 people have died with COVID. In addition, what people need to know from the CDC is this: how many people died in the last 12 months from illness? On average, how many people die every year from illness? The difference between these figures will tell us the severity of the disease, generally speaking. And likewise, people in different age groups and different health risk categories need to be able to understand the increased risk of dying due to COVID for their particular situation. Information is always helpful.
Congressman Delgado, some local businesses have said that New York has been too slow to reopen its economy in places like the New York 19th, where we didn't see a huge outbreak of the coronavirus. Do you think the state has been too slow to reopen the economy in rural areas without a large number of cases, or do you agree with how it's been rolled out?
And I've tried to do that every step of the way. That's why I introduced a bill that would allow our small business owners to get a $25,000 PPE tax credit that they can utilize as they make sure that their small businesses are in the right shape. In the same vein, I introduced a bill that would allow our small business owners to reapply for PPP as they navigate through these very difficult times. At the same time, we have to do our work to make sure that our farmers are supported and continue to get the relief that they get through the coronavirus food assistance program. This is going to take some sacrifice. It's going to take some care, if you will, as we navigate these difficult times.
So are we too slow? Have we been too slow to open the economy after the lockdown? That assumes that we should have locked down at all. The most vulnerable people are people in nursing homes who don't benefit from a lockdown. And historically, those people who tend to die of infectious diseases tend to catch diseases once they're already in a hospital. So those people, too, don't benefit from a lockdown.
But I can tell you what happens when you have people on the far left like Andrew Cuomo in charge. Tens of thousands of people were put into nursing homes that should never have been put there. And because of that, those people's lives were put at risk. What we want to do is be smart about it. And what we want to do is make sure that local communities get to dictate whether or not somebody should be forced to wear a mask and whether or not their children are able to go to school.
Mr. Vanderwater, it's possible that a vaccine for the coronavirus could be ready for certain people in the next few months. Some have speculated about the safety of a vaccine created so quickly. Do you think that people should take the vaccine when it's made available to them, and will you get it when it's available?
Should people take the vaccine? Don't ask me to decide what people should do. Before I take any vaccine, I want to know what the fatality rate of the disease is. And I want to compare that to the fatality or injury rate of the vaccine. I would like to repeal the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which removes liability from pharmaceutical companies. They make a bad batch, some people die or get sick, the company should face the consequences. The taxpayers should not pay out those lawsuits.
I am not afraid to take the vaccine, but families should be able to decide whether or not their children are going to take a vaccine. In New York State, it's a terrible thing. I know a lot of families out there whose children are forced to take vaccines that they don't believe in. Now, I understand it's a touchy situation. I will also tell you, with regard to when we will get a vaccine, we've already established vaccines that are going through trial runs right now. Nobody should be forced to take it. But I will tell you this, when it comes to this pandemic, this is an area where I do believe that the federal government should be spending money and making sure that everybody can get the vaccine, and then they can do it at no cost. It should be made available to everyone for free.
Congressman, you have 45 seconds to respond.
Yes, the important thing about the vaccine is to make sure that the science dictates the timeline. That's the key, that the science dictates the timeline. The fastest timeline we've ever had for a vaccine is 4 years. And so the fact that we're, by some estimates, within a matter of months, it's a testament to the ingenuity of our scientists and our experts and the leadership of the medical community. Yes, if we go through that process appropriately, I certainly would take the vaccine.
I'm against the idea that the government should pay the pharmaceutical industry so that everyone can get it for free, because the taxpayers will be paying for it and will pay a lot for it. Let me also note and remind the audience that science doesn't dictate anything. Science investigates, period. No one gets to dictate anything in this country per our Constitution. We need to get away from the idea that keeps cropping up in this dialogue that leaders dictate what people on the ground do.
Congressman Delgado, some Democrats in New York want to enact new higher taxes on the ultra-rich to raise money for the state, which is facing a huge deficit. But others, like Governor Cuomo, think raising taxes on the wealthy could cause them to move out of the state, so we would lose their tax dollars anyway. What's your position on raising taxes on multimillionaires and billionaires to help fill the state's budget gap?
Should New York raise taxes on the rich? You frame that as a state question, but I'll answer it from the federal level, which gets to the heart of the problem of wealth disparity. We need a separation of corporations and state in this country, akin to the separation of church and state. Today, regulations and laws are written by the powerful for the powerful, and that's why government is basically giving money to the fossil fuel, pharmaceutical, and insurance industries. I think the main problem is that in 1913, we allowed the banking industry to take power from the U.S. Treasury to create new U.S. dollars. Now, surprise, surprise, the top 1% have over a third of the wealth of this country. Together, the top 10% have over 70% of the wealth of this country. And the bottom 50% of Americans have less than 2% of the wealth. The Treasury should take back its power from the banking industry to create new dollars. But, and this is important, only for public infrastructure. If we did this, the value of the dollar would be backed, not by debt, but by tangible assets, like hospitals and schools and fiber broadband, that we own and we can use. If we cut the war budget too, this could easily eliminate income tax for the bottom 90%, as well as reduce property taxes. We would just have to pay reasonable sliding scale fees to use the public infrastructure. Recently, for the COVID stimulus bill, the Federal Reserve just created trillions of dollars overnight for big corporations while we suffer. And we fight with each other. But our neighbors did not cause our economic disparity. We need to unite, but we don't want to try to take money from the rich to redistribute it to the poor, because they never get it. We want our government to stop giving money to the rich and to stop taxing the poor.
Because now we're projected to have multi-trillion-dollar deficits and debts post-COVID. Well, what caused it was that 2017 tax bill, which added a $2 trillion deficit on the backs of everyday working families. Now, listen, there's some good parts in that bill for middle and working class folks, but the vast majority of that bill, we're talking 80%, went to the top 1%. Corporations big corporations got huge cuts, 35 to 21%. And the promise was that there'd be more capital investment. And as we think about tax plans in the future, that is how I want to go about this, making sure that our tax code actually generates revenue for the people on the ground so we can invest in infrastructure, invest in broadband, invest in healthcare, and do the work of everyday Americans.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Vandewater, you have 45 seconds to respond.
Everything that my opponent just talked about is all code for, guess what, your taxes are going to they're going to go up. And one reason why we're in trouble is because prior to this president taking helm at the office, there was already $18 trillion in national debt. And that's a problem. That's why we have to reduce that.
Mr. Vandewater, Governor Cuomo has asked Congress for federal funding to help fill the state's budget gap, but U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been against that idea, calling it a blue state bailout. Do you think the federal government should provide funding for New York to help the state recover from the pandemic?
I do think, and we already have, and right now there's $1.8 billion sitting on Nancy Pelosi's desk, and she refuses to sign it. And I implore everybody to go on YouTube and look at the interview that she did with CNN with Wolf Blitzer over the last 24 hours. That answer is specifically what the far left thinks about this president and really about caring for people.
You know, and when I think back to the CARES Act, which we passed in March, 7 months into this pandemic, the last thing we got done on a bipartisan basis, March. And you know something? That bill had some state and local funding, but it was triggered if you had government units serving populations greater than 500,000. New York 19, we don't have that. And that's why I worked on a bipartisan basis with Lee Zeldin to introduce a bill, the Direct Support to Communities Act, which would ensure that every locality across this country, irrespective of the color of its state, would get aid to offset the loss of revenue that we are all going through right now as Americans.
Should the federal government bail out New York State government? Should the federal government bail out any state, all states, because we're all hurting? I think I've just answered the question of how we relieve taxpayers and fund public infrastructure at the same time. So I want to talk about bailing out the people of New York State, of every state. The median household debt is about $60,000. We've been encouraged by various government programs to go into debt, buy this overpriced home, get that overpriced education. If we eliminated that debt by erasing $30,000 per adult individual from the balance sheet of the banks, most Americans would have no debt, and some would end up with a credit, which could take the form of a health savings account or college or mortgage savings account or an IRA. This is called a debt jubilee, and it's similar to an ancient practice of Jewish people. It would, of course, hurt the banking industry because they're counting on collecting all that interest. Or better yet, they're counting on taking your property if you go into bankruptcy due to the fallout from the COVID lockdowns. This would be a radical solution. I understand that. We would be uncreating trillions of dollars of debt overnight, but think of it as the opposite of what we just did, creating trillions of dollars overnight for the banks to loan out.
Congressman Delgado, what is your vision for health care, and do you support Medicare for all? Why or why not?
Such an important question. You know, the vision I have is to no longer be the only developed country in the world without some type of universal care. Every other country developed has some public component that enables folks to not have to be beholden to the profit whims of the private marketplace. In America, the richest and most powerful country in the world, if you do not qualify for Medicaid, Medicare, or TRICARE, you are beholden. You are beholden to the monopoly of the private insurance marketplace. So, how do we fix that? Introducing a public option, as I did in my Medicare X Choice Act. This would allow folks the option, the choice, to choose the nonprofit public space via Medicare still receive the baseline ACA benefits and do so in a way where they're not being priced out of the system.
A civilized society does not allow people to die or suffer unnecessarily because they are poor. And because any public benefit must be available to all, I advocate for providing direct Treasury funding to build and maintain state health centers that will offer quality service at a low cost and free care after the patient pays a sliding scale deductible that would be about equal to what people pay now in yearly premiums. With such a system, those who take care of their health would not be expected to subsidize those who do not take care of their health, and no one would suffer economic hardships as a consequence of illnesses that are beyond his or her control. No citizen would be forced to buy insurance or pay a federal or state tax for this health care program. Businesses would not be required to provide health insurance for employees. And all government employees and elected representatives would be covered through this plan. Individual states should have the option of levying consumption tax on products that damage public health to further support the catastrophic health care, and the option of including charity-run health centers in their programs. The public health care system would operate alongside the private health care system, and people would have a choice to use one or the other.
Mr. Vandewater, you also have 90 seconds. Allison has another question.
Yes, slightly different take for you. Of course, what is your vision for health care? But specifically, should the Affordable Care Act be scrapped as the administration is arguing for in court right now?
What needs to happen is it's going to end up being phased out. So nobody has to worry about a lapse in insurance care. And I don't know if you've heard this before, I have. I remember a president of the United States of America saying you get to keep your doctor and you're going to have lower premiums. That's not what happened. You didn't get to keep your doctor and your premiums went way up. So these are empty promises that we've heard before. And to sit there and say that a non-public option for Medicare and health care is going to compete with the private sector is a falsity. It leads to full government control over your health care. And when they do that, they own you. And that's what their goal is.
Mr. Vandewater, 3 years ago, Republicans in Congress passed new tax reform legislation that lowered tax rates for many Americans, but also placed a cap on the deductibility of state and local taxes, also known as SALT. Do you think Congress should remove that cap? Why or why not?
You have 90 seconds.
Right. This is a very touchy situation because people in New York 19, rich people, were very detrimentally affected by this, but middle-class people, not so much. So I understand that it's a problem for New York because you have been living in a state where they tax you through the roof. And one way you got through those taxes was being able to deduct them from your federal taxes.
Yes, the cap should be removed. What's really sad and tragic about the cap is that it was implemented in part to pay for the permanent cuts to the big corporations. That's what it was done. They had to figure out a way to pay for it. So working and middle class folks, not just rich folks, people like you said, Kyle, are being taxed multiple times in our district because you got hamlets, you got villages, and everybody's getting taxed. And so people who have to pay their sales tax, income tax, by the time they get done deducting that, there's no more room to deduct anything else. So this is not just a rich thing. This is about making sure that everyday Americans aren't being double taxed and actually being burdened to do so in order to give more money and put more money in the coffers of corporations that don't need it.
Should the SALT cap be repealed? So many complicated tax scenarios. Let's simplify things. I think we need a $50K standard deduction for all individual taxpayers. A progressive tax structure after that. Simplify the code. Get rid of all the deductions and loopholes that tend to be exploited by those who can afford to hire tax accountants. We also need a standard deduction for property tax. Retirees who have paid off their mortgage on a modest home should never be in danger of losing it for non-payment of property taxes. A government's objective should be to ensure the economic stability of its people, not to threaten them with eviction from a home that they have worked all their lives to own. Somewhere along the way, we've gotten into this crazy habit of thinking that a government is like a business and has to bring in as much revenue as possible. No. The first objective of good government is to do no harm. Taxing people who don't have enough to own a home, pay for education, retire, or spend time with their families is harmful. I agree with the once famous New York economist, who we hardly hear about anymore, Henry George. He correctly noted that property tax on capital improvements is one of the leading causes of poverty, because it leads to the hoarding of land by wealthy speculators. Property owners should be able to improve their property, build on it in order to earn money from that investment, an accessory apartment or something, or just improve their home to be able to benefit from it without paying higher taxes. Property taxes should be based on the land value only, that is, how close it is to commercial traffic or to public infrastructure that's usable, that's useful. With this type of strategy, property owners would be paying for the benefits and services that they get by being located in specific areas. And there's no reason to allow tax deductions for paying for these kinds of benefits and services.
Congressman Delgado, some in the 19th District strongly oppose any more laws to limit access to guns, saying they're protected under the Second Amendment. Should the country or the state pass more gun control laws? And if so, what changes would you like to see?
When you are at a point where we are seeing mass shootings to the degree that we are, we have got to revisit whether or not we should think about how to limit access to firearms to account for the rise of some of these instances, whether in churches, in synagogues, whether they're in movie theaters and concert halls, or in our schools.
I am a Second Amendment man. I am a military man. And I'm the most educated person, I can guarantee you, in this room right now to discuss weapons and guns. And I'm going to tell you I'm a Second Amendment all the way, and I'm also for reciprocity. People that are law-abiding citizens deserve to carry arms. If you curtail it, guess what? You're still going to have the same amount of murders that happen in Chicago because the criminals will still get their hands on it.
Thank you, Mr. Vandewater.
We are a violence-obsessed culture. Our federal and state governments too frequently rely upon violent means to address our problems, whether with the military or militarized police. Our entertainment industry, in turn, tends to glorify this institutional violence. So government should lead by example and end its reliance upon violence as a means of controlling other countries and its own citizens. Recently, we saw police marching down residential streets behind armored vehicles, shooting at residents who came out on their porch to see what was going on, shooting rubber bullets or something like that. There is probably no other time in recent history when the Second Amendment seemed as important to me as it does right now.
Congressman Delgado, you've been working on rural broadband legislation since taking office, and obviously the COVID pandemic has highlighted the problems with the quality and the breadth of rural broadband. Now, with kids learning from home, many families also working from home during the pandemic, which of your pending bills needs to get passed more than ever, and what else is needed?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing up rural broadband. This is a critical need. It was a critical need before COVID-19, and I was focusing on it intensely before COVID-19. We had a field hearing with Deputy Commissioner Jeffrey Starks at Columbia Green Community College to highlight this very need. I'm on the Rural Broadband Task Force back in Washington. And the issue is this. There's a lot of issues, but the main one is that the way we currently map is biased towards dense populations. It's called census block mapping. So if there's one house in a whole block, everybody in that entire block is deemed covered. That doesn't make any sense for rural communities like New York 19. And that's why in 2019, I made sure that during the appropriation season, I made an amendment that would say that no funding could be used for a methodology that was entirely based on census block mapping. We need street-level analysis, So I'm happy to get that through in 2019.
Mr. Vandewater, same kind of question. What would you do to advance rural broadband?
And you have 90 seconds.
That was a long answer for for basically saying I didn't get the job done. So everywhere I go in New York 19, I come into these pockets where people don't have broadband. And they didn't have it prior to my opponent taking office, and they still don't have it now. And we have no more time to sit there and say, I'm showing up, and we're going to talk about mapping, and we're going to create a committee, et cetera, et cetera. Get the job done. You don't get paid to just show up. You get paid to execute. And I promise you, I will execute, and we will do federal funding to ensure that there's broadband across New York 19. And this is an economic issue. This is an important economic issue. This is an issue because businesses don't want to come to New York 19 if there's no broadband. It makes sense for us to bring businesses here to ensure that they won't come here and that they have the tools that they can provide so that they can conduct business. And the other thing you need to watch out for is called the Green New Deal. Talk about broadband and the Green New Deal and what the Green New Deal would do to getting you broadband. That's a whole different story. When the people on the far left are focused on the Green New Deal and they're not focused on bringing businesses back to New York and they're not focused on getting broadband done in New York 19, and the people shouldn't have to pay for it. Because I can tell you a little bit about mapping. What ends up happening is that someone who can't afford it is charged thousands of dollars so that they can get broadband.
I've already mentioned how I would see funding through for fiber broadband to every single household in no matter how far away your household is from other people. The U.S. Treasury should fund public infrastructure directly. Any infrastructure that the Treasury funds should be managed by the people in the community that are using that infrastructure. So broadband for a community should be managed by the people who are using it. They should run it as a cooperative and make decisions about payments and different kinds of services. I don't know whether or not Mr. Delgado is pushing 5G technology, but fiber is preferable. It's the most well-tested, it's the fastest, it's the simplest kind of technology, and 5G is susceptible to hacking, privacy problems, all sorts of things that we don't want to get ourselves into what could be a real mess. So, and also some of the problems that he brought up with different ways of managing the conflict between the private service provider and the customer would disappear entirely if the Treasury directly funded the public infrastructure and then the people using it decided how to use it.
Mr. Vandewater, how big of a threat to this country and the world do you believe human-caused climate change is, and what steps do you think should be taken by Congress to address it?
It's a great question, okay? I believe that we should do everything that we can to ensure that the environment is as clean as possible. I believe in that. I'm a hunter, I'm a fisherman. I'm a father of 4 children, and I have a beautiful wife, and their future depends upon making sure that we live in a clean environment.
The science has told us that climate change is real and that carbon emissions are at the root of the cause. There's a lot of ways we can attempt to address this. I have chosen to focus on not just the moral imperative, as spoken about by Kyle, but also the economic one. The economic imperative. The vast majority of economic growth relies on major investment in renewable energy. And that's why my Green Jobs Opportunity Bill would create pilot programs to fund our community colleges, our high schools, our middle schools, to train up the young people for the very jobs we know we have to create and fill to transition ourselves off of fossil fuel, which again, the science has told us is causing climate change.
Instead of a Green New Deal, which advocates spending billions of dollars in effectively fighting pollution, I advocate for a Gold New Deal, which stops government from spending billions of dollars creating pollution. I would stop government subsidy of the fossil fuel industry. End all wars immediately. The Department of Defense is the largest institutional polluter. War destroys infrastructure and depletes massive amounts of resources. Stop the smart grid, which will require energy-intensive equipment and 24/7 chatter between devices among the Internet of Things, whose purpose is to gather data on our consumption habits, not to reduce consumption. I'm against carbon tax or allowing carbon credit trading. This is like paying for indulgences for the sin of polluting. It's perfect for corruption and abuse. We don't need to subsidize green energy if we stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Stop this corn and soy for ethanol subsidies. Let hemp growers fill that niche if they want to. Stop all government subsidy of fossil fuel intensive big ag. I would like to see state governments take control of the energy grid away from private energy companies and turn the control of the grid over to local municipalities with democratic oversight. The grid could be used as a public marketplace where energy producer and consumers can connect. A free market, cooperative energy grid. And finally, don't destroy existing fossil fuel infrastructure, as some people have recommended. This would be a waste of the embodied energy of that equipment. Let it be used until it's no longer economically viable, which shouldn't be too long once fossil fuel subsidies are removed.
Congressman Delgado, the 19th Congressional District is the 8th most rural district in the country. Which of your agriculture-related bills has helped the 19th District the most, and what's your next priority?
Well, in the one that I'm particularly, let me step back. Anything that becomes a law, right, is the best thing because it actually is going into effect. I can roll out a few bills that I've introduced to help our dairy farmers, like the Dairy Pride bill to make sure we get milk back in schools, and also my Farm to School Act, which would make sure that our schools are buying at a higher reimbursement rate from our farms. We have to develop our micro food systems here locally, and I'm trying to do that work. But my Family Farmer Relief Act, that became the law. The president signed that in August of last year, and it would lift the cap for Chapter 12 bankruptcy to allow folks who are making or who have a debt of $3 million up to $10 million now to reorganize, not go under, but reorganize and emerge financially more stable. That's law now.
Let me get back to the stance on the environment. Trust me, the far left is out there to change the entire world with the Green New Deal, but what that really means is it's going to be government control of everything, businesses and farms everywhere across the United States of America. It's unsustainable, and it is something that Nancy Pelosi pushes. It's something that AOC pushes. And my opponent has voted with Nancy Pelosi 99% of the time. It's a fact. So he'll be voting for the Green New Deal.
I'm going to give a short answer to that question. I'm a farmer. I understand how difficult it is to grow food and how expensive food really should be. It's artificially kept low by government subsidies, which prevents people from entering the industry and becoming small farmers. I would rather see, instead of more government subsidy and control of agriculture, I would want to see the government step back a little bit and give small farmers more of an opportunity to be successful in their business.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our hour, unfortunately, for all of us here. It's time for closing statements. Congressman Delgado, I'll go to you first.
Thank you.
And you have 30 seconds.
30 seconds, right? Yes. It's been good to be here. And listen, I grew up in upstate, Schenectady, working class family. Parents worked for GE. My wife, she grew up in Woodstock, an hour apart. We got married in Greene County at the Catskill. We're upstate through and through, and I care immensely about this community. I don't care what your party is. I just care about you, and I want to work for you, as long as you allow me to do so. And I hope that I've proven to you over my first couple of years how dedicated I am. And I will hope that you'll reelect me. Thank you.
Mr. Van. Mr. Vandewater, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. One of the biggest compliments that I've gotten as I've traveled throughout New York 19 and spoken to the people is that I remind them in some form or way of Chris Gibson. And I get it. It's the military thing. It's the high and tight haircut. But I want you to understand, I am a different individual than him, but I am very, very thankful that people compare me to him. And I promise I will bring the same level of integrity and workmanship and handing out olive branches to the other side if you elect me to Congress. I have 4 children. I grew up here. I fished here. I skied here. I hunted here. I went away. The only time I left was to serve this country. And I chose to come back here. And I'm here to fight for you.
How do I conclude a debate that I wasn't allowed to participate in? Well, let me tell you about ranked choice voting. That's a system of voting that allows voters to rank the candidates in order of preference. First choice, second choice, third choice, or just vote for one candidate if that's what you want to do. And then when the votes are counted, if your first choice doesn't win, then your choice goes to your second choice, and so on, until one candidate has more than 50% of the votes. 40% of registered voters do not identify as either Democrat or Republican. We need to pass ranked choice voting in New York to get rid of the spoiler effect and the prejudice against third-party candidates and the suppression of third-party voters so that all voters can participate in an election process. Thank you.
Thank you both for participating in tonight's debate. We really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone who is watching. We'll see you on New York Now later this week. Until then, have a great week and be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.